Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. Today, I am joined by Dr. J. Crisostomo, who is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies, graduate or undergraduate?
Yeah, graduate.
Graduate, okay. Studies at the University of Michigan. He is going to talk to us about Sumerian, which is always an exciting topic of conversation because we're just those kinds of people. But before we get into that, Jay, hi, thank you for joining me. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the field?
Wow, yeah. Long journey, but probably a fairly typical one, actually. So I started out growing up wanting to be a pastor. So I went to undergraduate college. I did Bible. I was getting kind of interested in that sort of thing. Eventually decided I didn't want to deal with people all that much, so I didn't want to be a pastor. So I went the academic route. And while I was doing the academic route and I was doing primarily Hebrew Bible, I got more interested in everything around the Hebrew Bible rather than the Hebrew Bible itself, and namely Assyriology, cuneiform, everything about that. One of the main reasons being that, unlike the Hebrew Bible, which is a closed corpus that people have been looking at for 2,000 years, Assyriology is a relatively young discipline. There's stuff that's always new about it. There's new ways to think about it. And so I saw it as more endless opportunity than Hebrew Bible and went that route. So yeah, I went to grad school for Assyriology, did the things for 6-7 years. I can't even remember anymore, and here I am.
Wonderful. That's actually almost completely parallels my husband's journey. He also did the pastor route, was a pastor for a while, and then went to grad school to start with in an effort to better understand the Bible by learning the languages that were around preceding and then at the same time, and then kind of did a sideways shift into Assyriology and Sumerian. So yes,
Right.
definitely a familiar story there. So the $1,000 question that actually we get asked quite a lot is, what did Sumerian sound like? And how do we know that? And my answer is always essentially, I think it's this, but I don't know enough to be entirely sure, because this is a whole corner of Sumerian and Assyriology on its own. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And it is very much a niche subject. One, sometimes I wish I didn't know enough about. Sometimes I don't know enough about.
Mm-hmm.
But I will absolutely talk all day about Sumerian. So the short answer to the question, how do we know what Sumerian sounded like, is basically we don't, right? I mean, for the most part, what we have is an approximation of a language that was spoken. What are we looking at? 4,000 years ago now. As far as I'm aware, nobody is alive who speaks Sumerian. Nobody is 4,000 years old, grew up speaking Sumerian. And everything that we know about it is kind of filtered through a bunch of different lenses. So for me, the analogy in reconstructing a language like Sumerian and the sounds of Sumerian is somewhat like history, right? Where we have fragments and little pieces here or there, and we make do with what we can to tell the story about a historical event or a historical context, and in this case, the sounds of a language that nobody has heard spoken in a long, long time.
Thank you. So what kinds of fragments are we looking at when we try to understand the sounds of Sumerian?
Yeah, so there's a lot of data that we're working with when it comes to Sumerian. So part of it is we can kind of get at some of this through the writing system itself. So when we have a word written in Sumerian, right, like the god's name Enlil, sometimes we don't really know too much about that, but we can say uh, when we're writing it, we write N, the sign Lil. And if there's something that follows it in Sumerian, then sometimes we'll get that consonant, that final consonant repeated. So en lil la. And so now we know, oh, the final consonant is ul, or however that was pronounced. So that's one form, that one way that we start to get it. The biggest way that we've worked on reconstructing this language, or the sounds of this language, are through a series of lists of signs and sounds that are connected with them. We most often call these sign lists. I've done a lot of work on these things, and so I've I spent a lot of time looking at this and thinking about this. So these sign lists often are primarily talking about signs, right? So each cuneiform sign, but more often than not, they will include ways how to pronounce the sign. So the sign "u," right? So they'll write the sign "u" on the tablet, and then they'll write next to it a gloss or something like that that says "u," and that's an easy one. Or the sign "mu," they'll say "mu u," and they'll get at this through a bunch of different ways. Part of the reason we understand the basics of these signs is because they're used for Akkadian, which of course we know a little bit more about because of its connection to other Semitic languages. And we've been able to reconstruct that a little bit more firmly than Sumerian, which, we have no relative languages, no familial ties to any other languages, anything like that. And so because we know words in Akkadian that use these particular signs, that helps us learn how to pronounce those signs a little bit better. And then we get these sign lists that help flesh this out for Sumerian in particular. So that's one part of the data that we have. And I could go on and even show you some of these sign lists and what they look like if you'd like later on. Another data set that we have to draw on for Sumerian is that sometimes as we know, Sumerian probably stopped being spoken around 2000 BCE, but the cuneiform writing system and the use of Sumerian continued on for the next 2000 years. And that means people were having to learn Sumerian in order to write this language, in order to recite this language, whatever it is they did. And as part of that, they might need to write little sheets for themselves, little guides for themselves about how to pronounce these things. So we get things that are called like syllabic Sumerian or phonetic glosses included in some of our texts. Again, I can show you that as well, and what that looks like. But usually it's some word like tesh, let's say, and then they'll write on there, oh, teesh, right? So to make sure that the person reading this knows, oh, this sign is to be pronounced tesh in this scenario. Finally, the last major data set that we have that we can think about are loan words. So we have loan words from Sumerian into Akkadian, and that gives us a little bit more of a picture about what Sumerian might have sounded like. So the Akkadian word parakum, which is like a dais, we know that's Sumerian barag. And there are certain standard ways that these words are transferred between the languages that help us be able to figure out what the systems are. So B in Sumerian sometimes is P in Akkadian. So paraku, barag, things like that. So those are some of the basic data sets that we have in order to flesh out a little bit more about what we know about Sumerian.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So you've said that Sumerian is obviously, as far as we know, an isolated language. We don't have anything to compare it to the way we do with Akkadian. When we're then trying to reconstruct the sounds of Sumerian based on bilingual texts, and it's how it would have been pronounced by Akkadian speakers, how secure are we in our understanding of how Akkadian sounded?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you raise an important caveat for all of this, right? Everything we know about Sumerian is filtered through Akkadian. So everything we decipher about Sumerian, it's because we think we know Akkadian, and therefore it's about Sumerian. But of course, most of our Sumerian stuff is written by people who no longer spoke it themselves. And that means it's written by probably Babylonian speakers or Assyrian speakers or who knows what else they were speaking. And that means we need to be a little bit careful about reconstructing Sumerian via Akkadian. Akkadian itself, we know relatively well, right? We have a basic inventory of sounds in the Semitic languages, and generally speaking, people who work on Semitics are able to figure out, okay, these are the sounds of Akkadian. Akkadian has more sounds, more phonemic sounds in its inventory than, for example, Hebrew does. But it's very similar to the sounds that Arabic has, or certain types of Arabic. So generally, we're able to understand a little bit more about Akkadian and develop our ideas about the cuneiform writing system, and by virtue of that, Sumerian, because we know, or at least we think we know a lot about Akkadian.
Thank you. Now, I know that in like the Old Babylonian period, there were instances of Sumerian being performed ritually, much like we have in the Catholic Church with the use of Latin. Do we know whether the people reciting the Sumerian knew what they were saying, or were they more saying the words written on the text because they didn't need to understand it? Really, the gods needed to understand it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people go back and forth on this. Personally, I think, at least in the Old Babylonian period, the majority of the people working on this stuff did at least have some idea of what they were saying. So there's a very famous example of the chief lamenting priest guy in the city of Sippar, whose name has completely slipped out of my mind as it happens. But anyway, we know he had to learn Sumerian. So from his house, we have a lot of educational texts. He was learning Sumerian, not necessarily the Sumerian he would use as part of his job, but we know he was learning how to read and write Sumerian to some extent. So if he's exemplary of other people going around and doing this profession at that time, then maybe then they actually did know what they were saying when they were reciting this. Later on, for sure, I would suggest they probably didn't know what they were saying, that they're just reciting sounds, reciting words, similar to the way, we might use Latin, id est, or, I mean, most of us know what that means, but, and things like vini vidi vici, most of us know what those mean, but we might just say them without necessarily knowing what they mean. Or even announcing the liturgy in a Latin speaking church or a Latin liturgy, you might ask a congregant to come up and recite this, and they may have no training in Latin whatsoever, but they can kind of read it and make it work. And my personal opinion is that certainly post Old Babylonian period, so we're talking the latter half of the second millennium and into the first millennium, most of them probably didn't know everything that they were saying. Maybe they knew some bits and pieces here or there, but it's learned and they can just kind of recite it and go along with it. In fact, to add to that, I know a number of people who sing in choirs, right, and have to learn languages just for choir, and they probably have, most of the time they don't actually know what they're saying, but they learn how to repeat sounds and they learn how to say things in the context of these songs. And I think that's a fair analogy for some of these ritual lamenters and ritual people.
Excellent, thank you. And so you've said that Sumerian was used long after really it ceased to be a colloquially spoken language. Did it just have a ritual use, or did it turn up in other contexts as well?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's actually a big part of the work I'm currently doing, is trying to figure out why did people use Sumerian, for what purposes and what reasons, especially after it stopped being a vernacular language. So in the Old Babylonian period, it's in particular a literary language. So people are writing new narratives, new hymns. Sometimes they're replicating old things, but using some of the same tropes and themes that they might know. Excuse me. But later on, it's definitely a scholarly language, a language that they're using by way of reference, to look at older texts, to interpret them, to comment on them, to think about new ways of looking at literature or other scholarly kinds of texts. It's also a ritual language, like we talked about. In the Old Babylonian period, I also think it's used as an administrative language, at least in certain parts of Mesopotamia, and southern Mesopotamia in particular, where we have a lot of legal contracts that are written in Sumerian so that they look exactly like they're Sumerian. Maybe they're reading them in Sumerian, maybe they're reading them in Akkadian, maybe they're reading them in something else. But there we have it as something of a legal language. Later on, in the period of Ashurbanipal, when he's collecting all of these things, he's collecting all known knowledge on tablets to put into his various libraries, or to make Nineveh this locus of knowledge and control and understanding of the world around him. He's bringing in people who claim to know Sumerian. He himself claims to know Sumerian, right? He says things like, I can understand inscriptions from before the flood, i.e. Sumerian. He understands Sumerian that nobody else understands. And so it definitely has this cultural weight to it. This idea that Sumerian is something that the elite knowers of the world should know and understand. And by knowing Sumerian, they can therefore understand the secrets of the world, the secrets from the gods. Generally speaking, we can contrast what's going on with Sumerian with, let's say, Akkadian. So one way of talking to the gods was through Sumerian. We talked about these ritual lamenters. They're praying to the gods in a special form of Sumerian primarily. Again, whether or not they know what they're saying is largely irrelevant for the ritual, but they're trying to communicate to the gods in a language the gods understand in that context. In a different context, let's say divination, there, everything we know about divination is basically in Akkadian. And so we can see these kind of two separate realms where language plays a part. The ritual, lamenting, prayer, community world, whatever we want to call that, which is done primarily in Sumerian and directed towards the gods, and divination, which is supposed to be this interpretation of the signs from the gods, but that's done very strictly in Akkadian, or almost strictly in Akkadian.
That's really interesting. Thank you. You mentioned that we have obviously literature in Sumerian. When we're looking at literature and thinking again about how Sumerian sounded, are we able to get a feel for maybe the oral nature of some of the texts that we have? Were they poems or poetry or songs, or is it just really too hard to say for certain?
So there are some people who will say we can detect things like meter in some of these songs. Certainly what we see is there is some rhythm to them, maybe not meter per se, but definitely an assonance or a feel to them. One of the things that we see a lot in Sumerian literature is repetition. So the beginning of Inanna's descent, for example, is she set her mind on from the great above to the great below. The goddess set her mind from the great above to the great below. The goddess Inanna, she set her mind from the great above to the great below, right? So we get that kind of repetition and parallel building strategies. And in Sumerian in particular, we start kind of vague and then build toward more specific. And we see that in the language as well. We also get a lot of repeated sounds, right? So either a particular vowel gets regularly repeated, or a set of consonantal sounds might get repeated a lot within a short set of lines. And that suggests that this kind of poetry, this kind of writing, this kind of reading of these texts certainly has some importance in the oral world, that people are hearing this, or that they at least understand that there is something to hearing this aloud.
That's very interesting. And I suppose it kind of touches on another topic entirely, which is ancient literacy levels. So even if these weren't composed orally, they certainly wouldn't have been like passed around as books for other people to read. They would have been performed for an audience of some kind.
Yeah, certainly. We get hints of that for sure, right? We get there are certain texts that we have, certain genres that seem to suggest that they're supposed to be performed in front of the king, that they have actors and things like that. And there's certainly this sense in which, memorization plays a part, and memorization may be for the sake of performance. That's always a bit of an odd topic to get into, because that's something that we have very little tangible evidence to get at, right? Other than these mentions of possibly performance. But they're certainly not being passed around as books for people to read. We know that, at least as far as scribal training goes, very few people are learning Sumerian as part of their education. It's a very closed group. So the schools that we have from the Old Babylonian period are usually, houses and not large institutions like the University of Michigan, where you get, 40,000 people learning this stuff. Not 40,000 people learning Sumerian, just to be clear.
We wish. We wish.
We do wish. But, these schools are, smaller groups of people, maybe 2 or 3 students at a time, learning Sumerian. And so if we extrapolate that out, you don't get a lot of people learning the whole breadth of the curriculum about Sumerian. So literacy levels, at least on that scale, are probably relatively low. We do know that people probably are learning practical writing, right? Enough to get by, enough to make sure that they're not being fleeced when they're selling their house or selling their field or something like that. And we know that some of these people are getting trained outside of these specialist schools. So they must be getting trained in some degree of literacy in Akkadian, maybe even in Sumerian, in order to fulfill their professional responsibilities. So, there's a long gradients, I think, in terms of literacy connected to spokenness and what's going on as far as sounds and how people are using Sumerian in that sense.
Thank you very much. We're going to take some audience questions in a minute. So if you're watching and you have a question for Jay, please do put it in the side chat. Make sure you tag me, because if you do not tag me, I will not see it. But before that, would you mind just showing us some of the cuneiform you were talking about, so people have a kind of an understanding of what you're working with when you're doing this kind of investigation?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I just hit present. Oh, sorry. We've got all sorts of things to look at here. Okay. Can we see this at all?
I have not seen it pop up for me to give you permission.
Okay. Let's try that again.
While we're working on this, we've had a couple of super chats. Thank you very much. Adrian Kim says, Dr. Crisostomo was one of my Sumerian professors in undergrad. What a lovely surprise to see him here. So thank you for your support and for saying hi. Always nice when that happens. Scott says hello. He'd like to hear from us more often. Luckily, we will be doing this more often because we have now settled our childcare issues. So I am free to work again. And Anne Stevens sends £5. Thank you for books and coffee. And we always appreciate money for books and coffee.
All right. Since I'm not figuring this out and I'm technologically inept, maybe I can do this on this other screen here. So let's see if I can bring this ever closer. There we go. So I hope you can see this. So this is a picture of 2 sign lists here. These are from much later periods. So the Neo-Babylonian period, around the time of one of the Antiochuses, Persian king. So here I have a nice example. If you can see this. So this column is the sign that we're talking about. So they write it out here, as well as how to pronounce the sign. So yeah, this sign here, we're looking at the sign ne, and this says pronounce it ne. Sorry, we're just looking at pronunciations, not the sign itself. In the next column, we look at the sign that's under discussion, which is the big sign here. And then next to it is this very small thing, which is a sign name. So they actually named the signs that they did. And this particular sign, which we know to pronounce ne, is named Piriku. And then over here in the farthest column, they actually have Akkadian translations or interpretations. So this is part of what helps us understand these signs and how to pronounce them, and get a better insight into what's going on in the world that they're working on. And again, these are late scholars who have never heard Sumerian spoken, at least from any native speaker. And that's a major caveat for us, right? Of most of the stuff we know, they didn't actually know particularly well either. And they're guessing, not as much as we are, but they're guessing all the same. Some of the issues with these sign lists in terms of learning what Sumerian sounds like is that we get a lot of variation. And that means that sometimes we have to make good educated guesses and use good critical frameworks in order to understand and make sure we understand what is being talked about. So that's all I desperately wanted to show you and make sure we talked about here. But the short of it is, we can make an approximation of what Sumerian sounded like, with a caveat knowing that we're dealing with a language that was used and changed over 3,000 years. We're filtering it through a different language. We have all of this masked by the writing system, including variations and what have you. And most of what we're doing is guessing as to what it sounded like, and in particular, what it sounded like to a small select group of people learning this language, particularly in the Old Babylonian period. And that's what we can kind of say about what Sumerian sounded like.
That was really illuminating. Thank you very much. And a much fuller answer than I've ever been able to give that particular question. So I'm just going to link people back to this video the next time I'm asked. So we do have a couple of audience questions before I let Jay go. Bernardo Gomez says, was there some kind of barrier to the people who were allowed to learn?
Usually it was an issue of class, to be honest. The people who can afford to go to, send their student or their child to be tutored by Sumerian, or to bring in a tutor into their own house. And therefore, these aren't kids who needed to be working in the fields or anything like that. There's a slight gender barrier as well. So we assume that most of the students were male. There were boys about prepubescent age, but we do have a few explicitly marked women, young girls who are also learning. But so class, socioeconomics, gender, those are some of the barriers to learning Sumerian.
Thank you. And this question is related. I have heard that Enheduanna established scribal schools for women. Would these be teaching Sumerian, Akkadian, or both?
That's a great question. So the question about Enheduanna is a very complex one. So we don't actually have anything from the time when Enheduanna herself would have been alive. We have legends, stories, maybe even myths about Enheduanna that are filtered through other myths, right? So we know about her. What we know about her is that she supposedly authored or compiled a couple hymns to the goddess Inanna, as well as a set of temple hymns or hymns about various temples. But all of our copies of those come from hundreds of years after Enheduanna herself would have lived. So if she were teaching, or if she established schools for women, it's most likely that we're talking here about Sumerian schools that would have been established in order to reinvigorate the life of Sumerian long after Enheduanna herself was alive, right? So we're taking the myth of Enheduanna and putting her name on the school building to say she's part of this institution. If you want to learn more about Enheduanna, our colleague, Dr. Sophus Helle, is actually writing a book about Enheduanna, along with translations of all of the works that are associated with her. And I believe he has started a new website with all of his writing on Enheduanna and some information about Enheduanna.
I think I saw that floating around Twitter, actually.
Yeah. So look up Sophus Helle I believe it's his pinned tweet on Twitter. So
Thank you. We have a question. You may not be able to answer this. How would you say all men must die in Sumerian?
oh my, all men must die. Trying to think here. So Lulu or Lu'ulu. So Lu'ulu would be the word for humanity or people in general. We could repeat that as much as necessary. Lu'ulu, Lu'ulu. So that's a totality. All men must die. He'ush, maybe Henush, something along those lines. Ush meaning to die. Henush meaning kind of like they should die, something along those lines. It's kind of a quick approximation. Trying to recreate what Sumerian would have been is a very tedious, tenuous subject. Although if you watch The Eternals, you'll be able to hear them say the word for father, where the young boy goes Ada, and the dad responds Kasha, run. So somebody's thought they could do it.
Someone said
Yep.
That's actually one of the question types I dread the most. How do you say X in Sumerian? Because I will sit down and work out what I think it is, but is it correct? I have no idea. It's as close as I can get.
Yeah, I doubt anybody who actually knew Sumerian would have any idea what I just said. So,
but you tried. What was the Akkadian variation of the Sumerian deity names for Enlil and Ninhursag?
Oh, that's a good question too. So Enlil in Semitic context is often Ilil, but it's still written Enlil, right? So it's basically just a Semiticized version of Enlil. Ninhursag, her name, she has different names in various Akkadian literary texts, and none of them are coming to mind immediately. Mamu is one, although that seems, I think I might be confusing that one with something else. Belet Ili is another mother goddess who takes similar roles as Ninhursag does. So some of those.
What projects would you most like to embark on over the next few years, and why?
Oh, thank you. That's a fun one. I'm actually writing a book right now, like I said, about basically the history of Sumerian and why people wanted to use Sumerian. And this is supposed to cover the entire history of this language. So 3,000 years looking at why did people as Sumerian as a language for religious purposes, Sumerian as a language for scholarly purposes, for bureaucratic purposes, for literary purposes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm hoping that book gets written in the next year or two and gets published soon thereafter. My plan, the way I'm writing it is, it should be, I hope that it would be something that anybody, here could read, understand. Enjoy might be a bit of a stretch, but yeah, that's the plan. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we have one last question, and then we will let you go. Have you found any errors that needed to be fixed in older translations?
Oh, I find errors to be fixed in older translations, in modern translation research, in my own translation research all the time. So, like I said, one of the fun things about this is that there is a constant need to reevaluate, to rethink, to explore. There's always new stuff. And when there's new stuff or new ways of thinking about it, that means we have to go back and revisit some of this older research, some of this newer research, some of my own research. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's obviously better for me to catch my own mistakes than other people. But if other people catch it as well, that's what this is all about. We're on a journey together to learn and figure this out. And I can't possibly claim to know everything about this field. So yes, in short.
Thank you. So I know I said last question, but we had two more come in quick succession. Do you have 5 minutes
Sure.
just to thank you?
Yeah, of course.
Mark is asking if there are any sources for the translation of personal names.
Personal names are always sketchy. So even things like that. So Enki is an easy one, right? We can kind of make that work. Most of the time we're guessing. You could go into what the Babylonian scholars themselves were doing, they would make up etymologies for some of these names themselves, usually for Akkadian names. But they would try to do like this elaborate hermeneutical process to make these names sound really cool. But even things like you'll read Enlil is Lord of the Wind, but in Assyriological research, there's a huge debate about what that actually means, whether his name is actually Enlil or something else entirely. So it's a big sinkhole as far as I'm concerned.
Is that true for like the names of just the average person on the street as well, or is that mainly for deities?
A lot for deities, but the average person on the street is usually, their name is usually some kind of sentence, right? So Enlil is great, or my favorite is Gula Azu, or Nin Isin Azu, right? Gula is a doctor, or Nin Isin is a doctor, things like that. So those are a little bit more easy for the average person on the street. But yeah, once you start getting into gods, sometimes we don't know. Nin Isin is easy. That's the Lady of Isin. Whether Nin is lady or lord or master, then you start. That's a whole. We're off the rails now.
Thank you. And last one from Chuck. So Sagiga in many translations is just literally the black-headed, but then translations today is humanity. Which is more accurate, maybe?
Yeah, so literally it is black-headed, but but the understanding is that it refers to the people of the land, right? So the citizens of the land, in particular the Mesopotamians, whatever that looks like. So the people over whom the gods have care, which for them would have been, that smaller group in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, or whoever is there, but in theory encompasses all of humanity. So that's why, yes, both translations are accurate. But if you want to be more specific, it's usually the people under the gods' care, specifically the Mesopotamians, the people of the Kalam, the land itself.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another brief super chat from Wittgenstein's Beetle for $5. Thank you very much. We appreciate the support. And we're going to end today's show here. Jay, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. It's been very interesting and enjoyable.
Thank you so much, Megan. This was fun.
Of course. Have a lovely afternoon. And everybody else, remember, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.